Imagine a military campaign so ambitious that it stretches across thousands of miles, involves millions of soldiers, and promises to reshape the balance of power in Europe, but is doomed from the very start. This was Operation Barbarossa, Nazi Germany's massive invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. At first glance, it might seem like a story of military brilliance, precision, planning, and unstoppable force. But dig a little deeper, and a different picture emerges, one of overconfidence, miscalculation, and a lack of clear strategic vision. Germany, despite its early successes in Western Europe, underestimated the sheer scale and complexity of the task ahead. The operation was not just a matter of moving troops across a border. It was an attempt to conquer one of the largest nations on Earth, with vast territories, extreme weather conditions, and an army that, while initially underestimated, would prove both resilient and resourceful. The seeds of failure were planted long before the first tank crossed the frontier. German planners had a general idea of their objectives: capture Moscow, crush the Red Army, and secure living space for the Reich. But these goals were more ideological than practical. There was no detailed roadmap for how to manage logistics over such immense distances, how to supply millions of men, or how to adapt when the campaign inevitably faced setbacks. This lack of clarity was not just a minor oversight, it shaped every decision from the very beginning, setting the stage for frustration, chaos, and ultimately, disaster. What makes Operation Barbarossa especially fascinating is the contrast between German expectations and the reality on the ground. Hitler and his generals assumed the Red Army would collapse after a few decisive battles, imagining a swift march to victory that would cement Germany's dominance in Europe. Yet the Soviet Union, despite its initial setbacks, responded with an unexpected combination of strategic depth, sheer manpower, and an ability to endure hardships that German planners had not fully considered. Harsh winters, long supply lines, and the massive scale of Soviet territory turned what was supposed to be a lightning campaign into a grinding struggle that would stretch for years. But beyond the strategy and tactics lies a story about human ambition, pride, and misjudgment. Operation Barbarossa is a reminder that even the most formidable forces can stumble when planning is guided more by ideology than careful calculation. The lessons from this campaign go beyond history. They speak to leadership, decision-making, and the importance of understanding the limits of power. If you are intrigued by stories of history that reveal the unexpected, the mistakes, and the lessons that echo through time, you are in the right place. Hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you do not miss the next deep dive into the events that shaped our world. Today, we are about to unravel the story of how Germany, despite appearing invincible, walked into one of the greatest strategic blunders of the 20th century. Stay tuned, because what follows is a tale of ambition, miscalculation, and the human costs of war, as the German war machine prepared to roll eastward. The conflict they were about to ignite was not merely a struggle for territory or resources, but a confrontation of two radically opposing worldviews, each claiming the right to dominate the future of Europe. Fascism and communism, the defining ideologies of the 20th century, collided on a scale never before witnessed, and the stage was set for a war in which human lives would be regarded as expendable pawns in a grand, ideological chess game. For Adolf Hitler and the Nazi leadership, this was not simply about defeating an enemy army. It was about annihilating a system that threatened their vision of racial and political supremacy. The Soviet Union, with its ideology rooted in class struggle and collective ownership, represented the antithesis of everything the Nazis believed in. And thus, from the earliest planning stages, The invasion was infused with an intensity that went far beyond conventional warfare, driven by the conviction that the destruction of the opponent was both a military necessity and a moral imperative in their eyes. The Germans imagined themselves not as invaders facing a human adversary, but as agents of historical destiny, tasked with reshaping the landscape of Eastern Europe according to racial hierarchies codified in their twisted ideology. This vision was manifested in policies that went beyond the battlefield, extending into the treatment of prisoners, civilians, and the very fabric of conquered society. Orders were issued that dehumanized the enemy, stripping away any protections traditionally afforded under the laws of war, and instilling in the troops the belief that mercy was neither expected nor desirable. The ideological framing of the war created an environment in which extreme brutality was normalized and even celebrated. And this, in turn, colored every decision made at the strategic, operational, and tactical levels. Soldiers advanced not only with tanks and rifles but also with a mindset molded by propaganda that depicted their opponents as existential threats to civilization itself, subhuman figures who stood between Germany and its destined expansion eastward. Yet, even amid this dark machinery of ideology and war, the complexity of reality intruded in ways that German planners had consistently underestimated. The Red Army, initially perceived as poorly organized and vulnerable, demonstrated resilience and adaptability that belied Nazi assumptions. And the sheer scale of the Soviet Union meant that every advance stretched supply lines thin and exposed soldiers to harsh climates and unforgiving terrain, while ideology had motivated rapid decision-making and aggressive offensives. It also blinded leaders to the logistical and practical realities of a campaign spanning thousands of kilometers across diverse landscapes. The ideological lens through which the Nazis viewed the war provided certainty and purpose, but obscured the necessity of measured planning, creating a tension between ambition and capability that would have profound consequences as the campaign unfolded. This ideological framing also had profound human consequences, shaping the interactions between invaders and those they sought to subjugate. The civilian populations of occupied territories were caught between fear and necessity, witnessing the violent implementation of Nazi racial policies while attempting to navigate the uncertainties of survival under occupation. Communities were shattered, social structures dismantled, and individuals were forced to confront the reality that in this war, ideology had become a weapon as lethal as artillery or tanks. In the minds of German commanders, the conflict was a moral crusade that justified extreme measures. But for those on the receiving end, it was an existential struggle, and the human cost of this ideological obsession was staggering. It became increasingly clear that the war was not only a contest of armies but a contest of beliefs, with the outcome of the ideological confrontation dictating the fate of millions. At the same time, the framing of the war as a struggle between fascism and communism influenced the perceptions and morale of the soldiers themselves. German troops were indoctrinated to believe they were participants in a decisive historical moment, and this perception encouraged extraordinary acts of bravery and perseverance. But it also desensitized them to the suffering inflicted upon their adversaries. Propaganda emphasized the moral righteousness of their mission, presenting the destruction of the Soviet system as both inevitable and necessary. And this narrative reinforced the willingness of individuals to carry out orders that in any other context would have been unthinkable. The ideological narrative thus functioned as both a motivating force and a mechanism of psychological justification, shaping not only strategic choices but also the ethical framework within which actions were taken. The intersection of ideology and warfare created a dynamic in which every decision was measured not only in military terms but also in terms of alignment with Nazi principles. And this confluence magnified the consequences of mistakes. Miscalculations in logistics, underestimation of enemy capabilities, or delays in operational tempo were no longer merely tactical errors. They were perceived as challenges to the moral and historical legitimacy of the campaign. This heightened the intensity of the conflict, driving commanders and soldiers alike to push harder, move faster, and take greater risks, often at the expense of prudence and the well-being of their own forces. The war, framed as an ideological crusade, thus became self-reinforcing, with the pursuit of ideological objectives compounding operational challenges and escalating human suffering on an unprecedented scale. Ultimately, the ideological framing of Operation Barbarossa intertwined with practical realities to create a conflict of extraordinary complexity, in which the ambition to annihilate a perceived existential threat collided with the unforgiving conditions of geography, logistics, and human endurance. It is this fusion of ideology and strategy that makes the campaign both compelling and cautionary, revealing how deeply held beliefs can drive decision-making and shape the course of history in ways that defy conventional military logic. In examining the invasion of the Soviet Union through this lens, we gain insight not only into the strategic failures of Nazi Germany, but also into the human capacity for both conviction and error, for belief and hubris, and for the profound consequences that arise when ideology dictates the conduct of war. In the autumn of 1939, as Europe teetered on the brink of an unprecedented conflict, two of the continent's most formidable powers reached an agreement that would both shock the world and shape the trajectory of the war to come. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, commonly known as the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Treaty, was signed amidst a climate of suspicion, propaganda, and strategic maneuvering, a compact that promised neither friendship nor alliance in the conventional sense but instead carved out a temporary period of security for both nations to pursue their respective ambitions. For Hitler, the agreement was a tactical masterstroke that allowed Germany to turn its gaze westward without fear of immediate retaliation from the vast territories of the East, providing a critical window to consolidate power, execute swift military campaigns against France and the Low Countries, and strengthen supply lines in preparation for what he envisioned as the eventual conquest of the Soviet Union. The pact was never a gesture of genuine cooperation. It was a calculated pause, a mutual recognition that each side required breathing space to achieve its own objectives before the inevitable collision of ideologies would erupt into open conflict. For the Soviet Union, the treaty offered a similar reprieve but for vastly different reasons. Stalin, who had watched the rise of Nazi Germany with cautious apprehension, recognized that the Red Army was far from fully prepared to withstand a full-scale invasion, despite improvements made since the humiliating losses of the early 1930s. The non-aggression agreement provided time to modernize weaponry, expand training programs, and strengthen defensive infrastructure along the western frontier, all while avoiding the immediate pressures of engagement with an adversary that, on paper, seemed both aggressive and highly competent. In this way, the pact acted as a strategic pause, giving the Soviets space to rearm and reconsider their defensive doctrines in a world increasingly dominated by blitzkrieg tactics, mechanized units, and the psychological momentum of rapid conquests. Neither side entered into the agreement in good faith, and both understood that the respite it offered was fleeting. It was a calculated interlude, a moment in which preparation and deception became the dominant currencies of power. This interlude created a period of unusual stability along the Eastern European frontier, a deceptive calm that masked the undercurrents of ideological hostility and territorial ambition. While Germany swiftly moved to subdue Poland and consolidate gains in Western Europe, the Soviet Union quietly reassessed its strategic vulnerabilities and focused on logistical modernization, troop mobility, and the production of modernized tanks and aircraft that would later play a decisive role in the Eastern campaigns. Both nations were acutely aware that the temporary truce was fragile, yet it was embraced pragmatically as an opportunity to strengthen positions without committing to immediate bloodshed. Historians often emphasize the paradox of this period. The two ideological enemies, fascism and communism, maintained a tactical coexistence that was predicated entirely on timing, calculation, and mutual suspicion, and the very act of refraining from conflict became a strategic instrument in itself. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact also carried with it secret clauses that reshaped the map of Eastern Europe and underscored the transactional nature of the agreement. Borders were redefined, spheres of influence delineated, and Poland was effectively divided between the two powers, demonstrating that the pact was less about peace than about the opportunity to pursue expansion without interference. This period of calculated non-aggression allowed Germany to divert resources and attention westward, executing campaigns with a precision and speed that shocked the Allied powers, while the Soviet Union absorbed the lessons of prior missteps and prepared for an inevitable confrontation with a nation whose ideological ambitions and military might would one day threaten its sovereignty. The dual benefit of time: Germany to consolidate and expand. The USA to ram and fortify was the hidden logic of the pact, a temporary alignment of convenience that masked the underlying inevitability of conflict. Yet, beneath the surface of these strategic calculations, the pact also revealed the limitations of human foresight in the theater of war. Both sides believed they could control the timing and conditions of the future conflict, but the complexities of geography, logistics, and human endurance would soon demonstrate that preparation alone could not guarantee success. The Germans, confident in the superiority of their mechanized forces and tactical doctrines, assumed that a few months of Western victories had secured their position and that the Red Army would be similarly brittle when the Eastern campaign commenced. Meanwhile, Soviet planners worked to transform perceived weaknesses into strengths, reinforcing defensive lines, decentralizing command structures, and stockpiling resources in anticipation of a confrontation whose scale and ferocity would surpass any previous expectations. The period of non-aggression thus became a crucible for preparation, testing the capacity of both nations to translate strategic pause into operational readiness. As the months passed, the apparent calm along the frontier created an almost illusory sense of security, particularly for German leadership. Hitler, having triumphed in the West, increasingly viewed the Eastern campaign as a matter of historical inevitability rather than operational risk, interpreting the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact not as a temporary convenience but as a psychological validation of his ability to manipulate circumstances in his favor. For Stalin, the reprieve was sobering yet vital, offering the chance to modernize industries, train officers, and reassess military doctrine in the shadow of a looming invasion. Both nations were thus engaged in an elaborate dance of strategic patience, each aware that the other's intentions were hostile but constrained by the temporary framework of non-aggression. Ultimately, the pact illustrates how timing, preparation, and deception can shape the early stages of conflict in ways that extend far beyond the battlefield. It was not a matter of friendship, trust, or shared values, but a calculated interlude during which both Germany and the Soviet Union sought to optimize their positions before the inevitable clash. The German ability to prepare for Western campaigns, coupled with the Soviet opportunity to rearm and reorganize, highlights the profound influence of strategic pauses in history, and it underscores the fragile balance between power, planning, and circumstance that defines the outcomes of great conflicts. In retrospect, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was less an alliance than a mirror reflecting the ambitions, fears, and calculations of two regimes on the cusp of one of history's most devastating confrontations. A temporary silence before the storm of Operation Barbarossa would rend Europe apart and reveal the limits of even the most carefully negotiated reprieve. By the spring of 1940, Europe was witnessing a form of warfare that would come to define the early years of World War II, a strategy that combined speed, coordination, and psychological shock in a way that seemed almost unstoppable. And it was in the execution of these campaigns that Adolf Hitler's confidence reached its zenith. The so-called Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, had transformed theoretical planning into a dramatic demonstration of power. As German forces swept through the Low Countries and France with a speed and precision that confounded both military analysts and civilian populations alike. The fall of France, coming within weeks of initial engagements, seemed to confirm for Hitler that his strategic genius and the efficiency of the German military machine could overcome even the most fortified and resourceful of opponents. For a leader whose worldview was rooted as much in ideology as in practical observation, these victories were more than operational successes. They were proof that his conception of military dominance was correct, and that the boundaries of possibility were defined by will and decisiveness rather than by geography or the complexity of logistics. The Blitzkrieg campaigns also provided a dangerous form of reinforcement for Hitler's perceptions of the Red Army, which he and his generals had long dismissed as a cumbersome and poorly led force. The rapid collapses in the West seemed to validate the notion that speed, surprise, and concentrated force could defeat any opponent, regardless of numerical advantage or defensive preparation. It is essential to understand that Hitler did not view the Soviet Union as merely another theater of war. It represented an existential confrontation between two ideologies and a stage upon which the broader destiny of Europe would be determined. The ease with which Germany had conquered France and the Low Countries emboldened him to believe that similar principles, if applied to the vast expanses of the East, would produce equally decisive results, despite the enormous differences in terrain, climate, and the industrial capacity of the Soviet Union. Confidence born from victory can be both a motivator and a deceiver, and in the case of Hitler's decision-making, it arguably did both. The psychological impact of Blitzkrieg success was profound, instilling a sense of inevitability in the minds of German commanders that the Eastern Campaign was not a gamble but a continuation of a seemingly unstoppable historical momentum. Soldiers who had witnessed the rapid advances in Western Europe carried with them the belief that their training, equipment, and leadership were superior, and this collective assurance further cemented the perception that the Red Army, despite its numbers, could be subdued with a combination of tactical brilliance and ruthless efficiency. In practical terms, this confidence translated into operational decisions that prioritized speed and encirclement over caution and logistical prudence, a choice that would later reveal both the strengths and limitations of the German approach. However, the victories in the West also created a subtle trap for Hitler and his generals, as they fostered a form of strategic overreach. The successes encouraged the belief that Germany could dictate the terms of any confrontation, leading to the assumption that operational plans developed for France could be directly adapted to the Soviet Union without adequate consideration for scale, climate, or the resiliency of an enemy that, unlike France, was not constrained by geographical proximity to Western Europe. The contrast between the relatively small, densely populated territories of Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern France, and the vast, sparsely populated expanses of the Soviet interior, was immense, and the logistics required to sustain a rapid advance across thousands of kilometers were daunting. Yet, buoyed by prior triumphs, the German leadership often underestimated these challenges, framing them as obstacles that discipline, planning, and ideological fervor could easily overcome. The psychological component of Blitzkrieg's success also played a critical role in shaping the ideology-driven objectives of the Eastern Campaign. Hitler's victories in Western Europe did more than demonstrate military capability. They reinforced the narrative that Germany was the rightful arbiter of continental power, and that its destiny lay in the conquest and reorganization of Eastern Europe. Ideological and strategic ambitions became inseparable, with the experience of rapid conquest providing both confidence and a sense of historical mandate. The ease with which German forces had overrun the French army encouraged a perception that speed and shock could substitute for detailed planning in the East, a notion that would have profound implications as Operation Barbarossa unfolded. As the German High Command analyzed their successes, there was an almost intoxicating sense of inevitability that colored their planning for the invasion of the Soviet Union. Lessons from France and the Low Countries were abstracted into a set of operational principles: massed armored thrusts, close air support, and encirclement of enemy forces to prevent organized retreat. Yet the transposition of these principles to the Eastern Front ignored the complexity of scale, the severity of the Russian winter, and the ability of the Red Army to absorb early losses while reorganizing in depth. The experience in the West had proven that speed could win battles, but it had not proven that it could secure strategic objectives over a front stretching thousands of miles across an opponent's homeland. Nevertheless, the psychological momentum of Blitzkrieg imbued the German leadership with a level of certainty that would drive the campaign forward, for better or worse. The cumulative effect of these victories, both in practical and psychological terms, was a boldness that bordered on hubris. Hitler, witnessing the collapse of the French state and the capitulation of a modern military power within weeks, concluded that the conquest of the Soviet Union was not only possible but inevitable, a natural extension of Germany's historical mission. The operational plans that followed reflected this belief, emphasizing rapid penetration, encirclement, and the annihilation of enemy forces before they could mount a coherent defense. Yet as subsequent events would reveal, the assumptions that underpinned this confidence were fragile, resting on comparisons with a very different theater of war and underestimating the resilience, resources, and strategic depth of the Soviet state. In essence, the Blitzkrieg victories in Western Europe did more than secure territory and demonstrate military innovation. They fundamentally shaped Hitler's worldview, amplifying his confidence and reinforcing the belief that operational audacity could overcome even the most daunting challenges. They created a momentum that both inspired German forces and blinded them to the unique complexities of the Eastern Front, setting the stage for one of history's most ambitious and ultimately overextended military campaigns. As the momentum of German victories in Western Europe settled into the consciousness of both the military and the civilian population, the focus of the Reich inevitably turned eastward, toward the vast and untamed expanse of the Soviet Union. In theory, this shift should have marked the beginning of a period of meticulous planning, careful coordination, and unified strategy, yet the reality was far more fragmented, reflecting the complex interplay between Hitler's personal ambitions, the autonomy of the various military branches, and the limitations of even the most disciplined command structures. From the early months of 1940 onward, the Army High Command, the Navy, and the Luftwaffe each began drafting their own operational proposals, each reflecting the priorities, capabilities, and perspectives of their respective service, and each doing so without full integration into a single coherent plan. The result was a multiplicity of blueprints, often conflicting in terms of objectives, timing, and allocation of resources, creating a situation in which strategic clarity was subordinated to bureaucratic compartmentalization and inter-service rivalry. Hitler's role in this process was simultaneously decisive and disruptive, a reflection of his belief in the primacy of personal vision over collective judgment. While the General Staff sought to establish a coherent framework for an Eastern campaign, Hitler frequently intervened, altering troop movements, emphasizing ideological targets, or imposing deadlines that disregarded logistical realities. These interventions, though often inspired by his perception of strategic opportunity or moral imperative, had the unintended effect of sowing confusion among the officers responsible for executing the plans, creating tension between operational feasibility and the Frei's ambitions. Senior officers, aware of the risks inherent in fracturing command and ignoring established principles of war, sometimes recorded their dissent in personal diaries or reports, yet their influence was limited in the face of Hitler's increasingly unquestioned authority. This dynamic produced a paradoxical situation. The German military, celebrated for its precision and effectiveness in previous campaigns, was now challenged by the very leader whose successes had propelled it to such heights, highlighting the vulnerability of centralized decision-making when personal ideology supersedes professional judgment. The compartmentalization of planning was further complicated by the differing operational doctrines of each branch. The army emphasized encirclement tactics and the rapid destruction of enemy forces, seeking to avoid prolonged engagements that would strain supply lines, while the Luftwaffe focused on air superiority, strategic bombing, and close support for advancing armored units. The Navy, though less directly involved in land operations, had to consider the protection of supply routes and the potential for action in the Black Sea and Baltic theaters. Each branch operated within its own conceptual framework, yet the Eastern Front would demand seamless integration across all domains of combat, from mechanized infantry and armored spearheads to artillery, reconnaissance, and air support. In the absence of unified oversight, these plans often conflicted or failed to account for critical interdependencies, leaving gaps that could and ultimately would be exploited in the heat of combat. Hitler's direct involvement compounded these challenges. Unlike previous military leaders who had relied on the expertise of their generals, he increasingly asserted himself as the ultimate arbiter of strategy, believing that his understanding of history, human psychology, and ideology provided insight beyond conventional military analysis. Orders were issued to prioritize objectives that reflected political or racial considerations, sometimes at the expense of tactical soundness, while simultaneous instructions demanded rapid advances that logistical planning could not realistically support. The constant revisions and last-minute changes disrupted the flow of information, creating confusion among field commanders who struggled to reconcile strategic intent with practical realities. Officers reported conflicting directives, units were reassigned mid-march, and contingencies were rewritten even as forces advanced toward the border, illustrating the precarious balance between ambition and capability that defined the German approach to the East. The interplay between fragmented planning and centralized intervention also had psychological consequences for the German military leadership. While Blitzkrieg successes in the West had instilled confidence, the ongoing uncertainty in planning introduced doubt, tension, and a sense of vulnerability. Commanders were required to navigate a delicate landscape. They needed to execute complex operations with precision, yet their plans were continually subject to alteration by a leader whose decisions were guided as much by ideology as by military necessity. This tension manifested in an environment where initiative at lower levels was constrained, and the ability to adapt to unforeseen challenges in real time was hindered by the overarching imperative to follow directives from Berlin. In essence, the organizational friction created by parallel planning, coupled with Hitler's frequent interference, undermined the operational cohesion that would be vital for sustaining a campaign across thousands of kilometers of hostile territory. Despite these internal challenges, preparations continued, and the machinery of war pressed forward. The German army, trained in rapid maneuvers and encirclement, attempted to align with Luftwaffe support, while the Navy coordinated contingencies for potential engagements in northern and southern waters. Intelligence reports, logistical calculations, and training exercises proliferated, yet they were often developed in isolation, requiring constant adjustments to achieve a semblance of coherence. Each new directive from Hitler could either reinforce or invalidate these efforts, producing a dynamic in which careful planning and improvisation existed in a state of continual negotiation. The resulting confusion was both a symptom of the ambitious scale of the operation and a reflection of the personal style of leadership that emphasized decisiveness, ideological alignment, and symbolic victories over methodical coordination. Ultimately, the fragmented planning and frequent interventions reveal the dual-edged nature of centralized control within a militarily sophisticated state. While Hitler's vision could accelerate decision-making and inspire extraordinary confidence, it also created conditions for miscommunication, logistical bottlenecks, and operational errors. The separate plans of the Army, Navy, and Luftwaffe, combined with the unpredictability of the FRAS adjustments, meant that German forces entered the Soviet Union with a strategy that was ambitious, conceptually coherent in parts, yet practically vulnerable to disruption. This dynamic set the stage for both the initial successes and the eventual difficulties of Operation Barbarossa, illustrating how the interplay of personality, ideology, and organizational structure can shape the outcomes of even the most meticulously planned campaigns. The narrative of preparation for the Eastern Front is thus not only a story of military ingenuity and confidence, but also a cautionary tale about the limits of control when ambition outpaces coordination. And it underscores how the very factors that propelled Germany to early triumphs would later contribute to the profound challenges it would face in the vast expanse of the Soviet Union. Emboldened by the rapid successes in Western Europe and guided by a combination of ideological fervor and operational confidence, the German High Command approached the prospect of invading the Soviet Union with an assumption that would prove both pivotal and dangerously flawed: that the Red Army, despite its vast numbers, would collapse quickly under the weight of a decisive German offensive. This belief was rooted not only in overconfidence, but also in a series of misjudgments informed by previous encounters, propaganda, and an underestimation of the opponent's resilience. The Winter War between the Soviet Union and Finland in 1939–1940, for example, had demonstrated apparent weaknesses in Soviet tactics and organization, and German observers interpreted this as evidence that the Red Army was fundamentally incapable of mounting effective resistance. Ignoring the context of terrain, weather, and political urgency that had constrained Soviet operations, the lessons drawn from this conflict, filtered through a lens of ideological certainty and operational pride, led to an expectation that the invasion would resemble the lightning victories of France and the Low Countries, and that logistical challenges could be overcome by rapid advances, overwhelming force, and the assumed demoralization of Soviet troops. Yet the reality of the Soviet military was far more complex than German planners acknowledged. The Red Army, though still recovering from the purges of the late 1930s that had removed many senior officers, retained immense strategic depth, both in terms of geography and resources. The size of the Soviet Union was staggering, stretching thousands of kilometers from the western border to the Ural Mountains and beyond, with a network of railways, supply depots, and industrial centers situated far from the front lines. German assumptions about quick victories failed to account for this depth, nor did they fully appreciate the capacity of the Soviet state to mobilize reserves, reconstitute formations, and adapt operationally even under intense pressure. While initial intelligence suggested disorganization and weak leadership, the inherent redundancy and scale of the Soviet system offered an unparalleled buffer against the concentrated attacks that German planners intended to employ. Moreover, the German view of Soviet troop quality was distorted by ideological narratives and the experiences of a few limited engagements. Blitzkrieg successes in the West, achieved against relatively well-prepared but geographically constrained armies, reinforced the notion that speed, mechanized coordination, and morale could overcome any opponent. Within this framework, The Red Army was assumed to be poorly led, rigid, and ill-prepared, a mass of conscripts who would crumble under sustained offensive pressure. This perspective overlooked the intensive training programs that had been implemented across the Soviet military, the evolving doctrines emphasizing depth, elasticity, and counteroffensive capabilities, and the increasing effectiveness of commissars in maintaining political cohesion and discipline within the ranks. The Germans also discounted the psychological factor of defending one's homeland, believing that ideological and racial superiority would outweigh the motivation of Soviet soldiers fighting for survival, a miscalculation that would prove costly. The German overestimation of their own capabilities and the underestimation of the Red Army's potential created a dangerous asymmetry between expectation and reality. Operational plans, influenced by the belief in rapid collapse, emphasized deep penetration, encirclement, and annihilation before the enemy could regroup, yet they neglected to anticipate the Soviet capacity for withdrawal, reinforcement, and the strategic use of terrain to slow and attrit advancing forces. In practice, this meant that initial gains, while impressive in speed and tactical effect, did not translate into the decisive strategic outcomes the Germans had envisioned. The vastness of the Soviet Union, combined with logistical strain, stretched supply lines, and the need to garrison occupied territory, undermined the assumptions of quick victory, forcing German commanders into a grinding advance over distances and conditions for which they had neither fully prepared nor understood. The misjudgment of Soviet resilience also had psychological effects on German leadership and troops alike. Early successes created a false sense of inevitability, leading to operational overreach and a willingness to take risks that compounded the vulnerability of advancing forces. Commanders expected each breakthrough to result in the wholesale disintegration of enemy formations. Yet they were repeatedly confronted with reorganized units, determined defensive positions, and counterattacks that contradicted the narrative of an inevitable collapse. These unexpected challenges strained the command structure, slowed momentum, and exposed the limitations of a strategy predicated on speed and encirclement. In this sense, the German assumption of rapid Soviet defeat became a self-reinforcing error. Shaping planning, expectations, and resource allocation in ways that magnified the operational difficulties as the campaign progressed. Furthermore, the ideological framing of the campaign exacerbated the underestimation of Soviet strength. German planners, influenced by racial and political doctrines, tended to dehumanize the Soviet opponent, viewing soldiers and civilians alike as obstacles to conquest rather than as adaptive, resourceful agents capable of organized resistance. This devaluation of the enemy contributed to tactical decisions that prioritized annihilation and encirclement over the pragmatic management of logistics and force preservation. Troop movements and supply allocations were often calculated under the assumption of a swift victory, leaving units vulnerable when operations extended beyond initial objectives or when the Red Army employed elastic defense strategies. Staged retreats and counteroffensives. Despite these miscalculations, the Germans advanced into Soviet territory with remarkable speed in the initial weeks, achieving significant encirclements and capturing vast numbers of prisoners. Yet the early victories masked the structural resilience of the Soviet military, which could absorb losses, reorganize, and draw upon the depth of territory and resources to continue resisting. Each tactical success thus carried the seeds of strategic vulnerability, as the campaign's assumptions rapid collapse. Minimal attrition and logistical sufficiency proved increasingly disconnected from the unfolding reality. The German confidence, bolstered by Western successes and ideological certainty, collided with the practical demands of waging war across an immense theater, revealing the dangerous consequences of underestimating a well-resourced, adaptive, and highly motivated opponent. In retrospect, the German misjudgment of the Soviet army illustrates the peril of conflating tactical proficiency with strategic inevitability. While Blitzkrieg had demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated, rapid operations against certain opponents, the Red Army's size, training, and strategic depth rendered similar assumptions invalid. The failure to accurately assess the Soviet military's capabilities not only shaped the operational planning of Operation Barbarossa, but also set the stage for a protracted, attritional conflict that would challenge the limits of German resources, endurance, and adaptability, ultimately exposing the gap between confidence born of early victories and the unforgiving realities of total war on an unprecedented scale. As German forces surged across the vast plains of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, the operational calculations that had guided their advance were accompanied by directives that transformed the nature of the campaign from a conventional military conflict into an instrument of ideological violence. And it is here that the story of Operation Barbarossa becomes inseparable from the moral catastrophes that accompanied it. Central to this transformation were orders such as the Commissar Order and the broad imposition of martial law, directives that provided a legal and operational framework not for the protection of human life or adherence to international norms, but for its systematic suspension. The Commissar Order specifically mandated that any political officers captured with Red Army units were to be executed immediately, a decree that effectively removed any possibility of due process, turning the capture of soldiers into a pretext for state-sanctioned killing. Simultaneously, martial law in occupied territories granted German units sweeping authority, shielding soldiers from legal accountability and authorizing them to act with impunity, creating conditions in which murder, pillage, and the destruction of property became normalized tactics rather than exceptions to discipline. These policies were not sporadic or ad hoc, but were deliberately designed to enforce the ideological objectives of the Reich, linking operational efficiency to the broader goals of conquest, racial domination, and the subjugation of populations deemed inferior. The consequences of these orders manifested almost immediately as German units moved beyond the border, where initial encounters with Soviet forces and civilians revealed both the scale and the nature of the atrocities that would come to define the campaign. Political commissars, who might have otherwise been treated as prisoners of war, were executed on the spot, sometimes identified solely by insignia torn from uniforms, a macabre administrative shortcut that converted uncertainty into a license for lethal action. Civilians, similarly, found themselves caught in an environment where traditional rules of war had been suspended. Towns, villages, and agricultural regions were subjected to random executions, forced labor, and confiscation, all justified under the broad rubric of maintaining security and facilitating the war effort. Soldiers who might have hesitated, or who had prior inclinations toward humane treatment, were frequently influenced by peer pressure, propaganda, and the implicit sanctioning of brutality, creating a feedback loop in which cruelty became both operationally expedient and socially reinforced within the units. Propaganda played a central role in normalizing and amplifying these actions, as illustrated by the carefully curated visual and textual narratives presented to the German public and to troops themselves. Photographs, newsreels, and films depicted the so-called Judeo-Bolshevik enemy in dehumanized terms, reinforcing the ideological rationale for extermination and making the realities of mass violence appear not only acceptable but necessary for the success of the campaign. The presentation of Soviet prisoners as subhuman, combined with reports of resistance or sabotage, fed the perception that extraordinary measures, including executions and collective punishment, were justified forms of military expedience. This intersection of propaganda and policy blurred the boundary between combat operations and systematic atrocity, ensuring that the operational objectives of encirclement and destruction were inseparable from the ideological imperatives of annihilation. The practical implications of these orders were profound, both for the progression of the campaign and for the human toll it exacted, as German units advanced through Belarus, Ukraine, and the western regions of Russia. Mass executions became routine, with thousands of prisoners of war left to die from exposure, starvation, or deliberate shootings. Entire communities were punished collectively, as the line between combatants and civilians dissolved under the legal protections of martial law and the Commissar order. The logistical simplicity of ignoring the well-being of captives, no food, no shelter, no medical care allowed military units to maintain momentum, but it also engendered deep moral and psychological consequences, fostering an environment in which soldiers could act without restraint and in which the civilian population became a tool of both fear and coercion. These practices, intended to facilitate rapid conquest and operational efficiency, ultimately contributed to the enormous human cost of the Eastern Campaign, creating an enduring legacy of atrocity that would resonate long after the battles had ended. The interplay between ideology and operational command meant that atrocities were not merely incidental to combat, but were integral to the German understanding of how the war was to be conducted. The framing of the Soviet Union as a racial and political adversary justified measures that in any conventional war would have been unacceptable, embedding moral transgression within military necessity. German commanders, from field officers to the highest echelons, navigated an environment in which orders from Berlin codified cruelty, and where deviation from these directives could be interpreted as disloyalty or a failure to implement the Reich's vision. As a result, decisions about life and death were bureaucratized, formalized, and routinized, with the Commissar order and martial law serving as explicit instruments of both ideological enforcement and operational expediency. The effect on occupied populations was catastrophic. Communities that initially greeted German forces as liberators from prior political oppression soon confronted the reality of a military machine indifferent to human suffering, capable of imposing death, displacement, and destruction with administrative efficiency. Reports from the front, including diaries, photographs, and wartime films, document the systematic nature of these policies, demonstrating how operational goals and ideological imperatives converge to create large-scale violations of human rights and the laws of war. The psychological impact on both perpetrators and victims cannot be understated. Soldiers were conditioned to see violence as routine and necessary, while civilians lived under constant threat, unsure who would survive the next encounter with the advancing army. Ultimately, the Commissar order and the imposition of martial law reveal the deeply intertwined nature of ideology and military strategy in Operation Barbarossa, illustrating how directives that dehumanized opponents and suspended legal protections facilitated some of the most egregious war crimes of the conflict. The campaign's initial operational successes cannot be separated from the mechanisms of brutality that accompanied them, and the story of the Eastern Front is inseparable from the moral collapse sanctioned by policy and enforced through execution. These orders transformed the battlefield into a space where efficiency, ideology, and lethal force coalesced, creating consequences that would echo for generations and leaving an indelible mark on the historical memory of the war. The victims and the perpetrators alike, underscoring the profound dangers of unrestrained power and the catastrophic human cost when strategy and morality are divorced from one another. As the German advance penetrated deeper into Soviet territory, the initial euphoria of rapid victories and the mass capture of prisoners began to clash with the unanticipated realities of extended supply lines and the immense logistical demands of waging war across such vast expanses. early encirclements were tactically brilliant, capturing hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers and inflicting substantial disruption on enemy formations. But these successes masked the vulnerabilities that would soon emerge as German units pushed further from their bases. The sheer scale of the Soviet Union meant that every kilometer gained translated into additional strain on fuel, ammunition, and food supplies, as well as the transportation infrastructure necessary to maintain operational momentum. Roads, railways, and communication lines were often damaged or underdeveloped, complicating the movement of reinforcements and the delivery of essential resources. And the pace of the German advance frequently outstripped the capacity of logistical units to keep up, creating gaps that the Red Army could exploit through counterattacks or strategic withdrawals. Moreover, the very tactics that produced the encirclements, the rapid thrusts of armored divisions, deep penetrations into enemy territory, and the concentration of forces at critical points exacerbated operational fragility. German commanders had designed these maneuvers with the assumption that the Red Army would disintegrate quickly. But when Soviet units demonstrated resilience, retreated strategically, or regrouped behind secondary defensive lines, the forward-deployed German columns found themselves isolated and vulnerable. Infantry, artillery, and support units lagged behind, struggling over poor terrain, under adverse weather conditions, and with limited local resources to requisition, while the armored spearheads, despite their mobility, were forced to slow or halt to address mechanical failures. Supply shortages, and the cumulative effects of combat attrition. The interplay of speed and overextension created a paradox in which operational brilliance simultaneously generated tactical advantages and strategic liabilities, leaving commanders to balance the momentum of the offensive with the growing risk of overstretched forces. Weather and terrain compounded these logistical difficulties. Summer rains turned roads into mud traps, slowing the movement of vehicles and artillery, while the vast forests, rivers, and marshlands of the Western Soviet territories disrupted coordination between units. Horses, still heavily relied upon for transportation, struggled to navigate conditions that immobilized trucks and armored vehicles alike, while the German reliance on mechanized warfare revealed vulnerabilities in a theater where infrastructure was inconsistent and distances were staggering. Every captured town or supply depot provided only temporary relief, as advancing units quickly consumed the resources on hand, requiring the establishment of new supply chains under increasingly hostile conditions. This constant strain undermined the very operational philosophy that had driven early successes, exposing a tension between the speed of attack and the sustainability of the offensive. The human dimension of overextension also became apparent. Soldiers, initially buoyed by early triumphs and the apparent weakness of the Soviet forces, faced the harsh reality of long marches, inadequate rest, and the psychological toll of constant combat and occupation duties. Morale, while initially high, began to erode as logistical shortages, unexpected resistance, and the sheer scale of the theater revealed the limits of endurance. Commanders were forced to make difficult choices between maintaining the offensive and consolidating positions to secure supply lines, a dilemma complicated by Hitler's frequent interventions. Ideological pressure, and the expectation of relentless forward movement. The tension between strategic vision and operational capability became increasingly acute, illustrating how the assumptions of rapid collapse and easy victory had created a brittle framework, vulnerable to disruption by the practicalities of terrain, distance, and human fatigue. Encirclement operations, while initially devastating for the Red Army, also imposed unexpected burdens on the German forces themselves. The capture of tens of thousands of prisoners created additional logistical responsibilities, including the need to feed, transport, and guard them, even as policies like the Commissar Order and martial law allowed mass executions. While these executions removed some of the immediate strain of prisoner care, they required coordination, manpower, and oversight, diverting attention from the advancing front and creating ethical dilemmas that affected morale and discipline in subtle ways. At the same time, the destruction of infrastructure by retreating Soviet forces, sabotage, and scorched earth tactics further impeded resupply, forcing units to improvise and often to rely on limited local resources, which could not sustain the scale of the German advance over time. The cumulative effect of these factors was a gradual erosion of operational efficiency. Armored divisions, which had spearheaded the Blitzkrieg-style thrusts, found themselves waiting for infantry and artillery support. Repair teams struggled to maintain vehicles over long distances and rough terrain, and supply convoys were delayed or disrupted, causing shortages at critical moments. The advance toward strategic objectives like Smolensk, Kiev, and Leningrad, initially conceived as a rapid series of decisive blows, became a protracted series of engagements that sapped the initiative of German commanders and exposed the limits of their planning. While early encirclements had inflicted tangible damage on Soviet forces, they did not translate into strategic collapse, and the strain on logistics and overextension increasingly dictated the tempo and possibilities of the campaign, rather than the original operational vision. In this context, the interplay between early victories and logistical strain illuminates a central theme of Operation Barbarossa. Tactical brilliance can be undermined by strategic overreach. The German advance demonstrated remarkable skill in maneuver, coordination, and execution at the operational level, but the lack of a sustainable logistical framework, the distances involved, and the resilience of the Soviet state revealed the inherent vulnerability of assumptions built on rapid collapse and ideological certainty. Every captured prisoner, every encirclement, and every temporary territorial gain carried with it hidden costs that compounded as the offensive continued, forcing commanders to confront the limits of human endurance, material capacity, and operational foresight. Ultimately, the story of early encirclements and prisoner captures illustrates how the successes that initially seemed to validate German strategy were inseparable from the challenges that would later constrain and imperil it. Momentum alone could not substitute for logistical stability or accurate assessment of the operational environment, and the overextension of forces became a defining characteristic of the Eastern Campaign. In retrospect, these dynamics highlight the tension between ambition and reality, revealing how even the most meticulously planned operations can falter when confronted with the scale, complexity, and unpredictability of war, a lesson as relevant to historical study as it would be to any future consideration of large-scale military campaigns. As the German war machine pressed deeper into the Soviet Union, the immense scale of the territory and the unpredictability of the natural environment began to exert a force no tactical planning or technological advantage could fully overcome, revealing the fragility that underpinned even the most confident assumptions of victory. The geography of Russia, with its vast plains, dense forests, winding rivers, and marshy lowlands, transformed every advance into a complex logistical challenge, demanding the careful coordination of mechanized units, infantry, artillery, and supply trains across distances that exceeded the experience of most commanders. Roads were often little more than dirt tracks, susceptible to mud in the spring or impassable conditions during heavy rains, and rail network, critical for the movement of heavy equipment and fuel, were frequently limited in reach, damaged by retreating Soviet forces, or constructed to a different gauge, forcing cumbersome transfers that slowed the pace of advance. Every mile gained stretched the thin lines of supply, turning forward momentum into a precarious balancing act between operational ambition and material reality. And the capacity to sustain forces over such expanses became as decisive as tactical ingenuity on the battlefield. Weather played a similarly unforgiving role, as the seasons shifted from summer into the long Russian autumn, bringing rain, cold, and the first whispers of winter, each element compounding the difficulties faced by the advancing German units. Vehicles, designed for speed and maneuverability on firm terrain, struggled through muddy plains that immobilized tanks and trucks alike, while horses, still relied upon to transport artillery, provisions, and ammunition, were slow, vulnerable, and limited in endurance. Soldiers themselves were exposed to the elements, often undernourished, fatigued, and psychologically strained by the relentless pace of operations and the unfamiliar conditions. Supply units, despite meticulous planning, could not fully compensate for these environmental challenges, and the interplay between natural obstacles and the demands of mechanized warfare exposed structural weaknesses in the operational doctrine, highlighting the extent to which the human and material elements of war were dependent on environmental stability, a factor the Germans had underestimated in their initial calculations. The combination of terrain and weather also complicated communication and command, as units became dispersed over hundreds of kilometers and radio networks struggled to maintain reliable links across forests, rivers, and marshes. Coordinating assaults, repositioning reinforcements, and responding to Soviet counterattacks became increasingly difficult, creating gaps in the lines and delays in executing orders that had been meticulously prepared months in advance. Early encirclements, which had seemed to validate German operational planning, began to reveal themselves as temporary successes contingent on maintaining cohesion across an ever-widening front, and the inability to rapidly reinforce or resupply units in contact with the enemy exposed the vulnerability of even the most confident advances. Local intelligence was limited, and Soviet scorched earth tactics destroying crops, bridges, and infrastructure during retreats further disrupted the movement of both troops and material, forcing improvisation under pressure and slowing the offensive momentum that had been central to the blitzkrieg philosophy. The physical demands imposed by the terrain and weather also magnified the human cost of the campaign. Soldiers, marching long distances under arduous conditions, faced exhaustion, illness, and exposure, while the psychological strain of operating in a hostile environment with limited shelter, food, and medical support eroded morale. Armored and mechanized units, though initially able to exploit mobility for breakthroughs, were constrained by fuel shortages, mechanical failures, and the inability to maintain lines of supply over extended distances. Even in moments of tactical success, the inability to consolidate gains quickly meant that forward units were often isolated, vulnerable to counterattacks, and dependent on stretched supply lines, highlighting the tension between operational ambition and the realities imposed by geography and climate. The logistical implications of Russian terrain extended beyond transportation and supply. Maintaining sufficient food, ammunition, and fuel for millions of troops over thousands of kilometers was a monumental task, one exacerbated by the destruction of infrastructure and the vastness of the country. Commanders had to contend with delays in resupply convoys, limited storage facilities, and the sheer complexity of coordinating multi-division movements across unfamiliar territory. Each setback, from a stalled truck column to a broken bridge, had cascading effects on the timing and effectiveness of military operations, slowing the advance and allowing the Red Army to regroup. fortify positions, and stage countermeasures that further challenged German assumptions of rapid collapse. In addition, the Russian landscape provided strategic depth that favored the defenders, offering opportunities for retreat, regrouping, and fortification that the Germans had not fully anticipated. Cities like Smolensk and Kiev became focal points for prolonged engagements, drawing German forces into protracted battles and sapping momentum. The vast distances between objectives meant that even minor operational miscalculations could result in overextension, exposing supply lines to disruption and forward units to encirclement or attrition. Unlike Western Europe, where infrastructure and geography often facilitated rapid mechanized operations, the Soviet environment demanded adaptability, resilience, and the capacity to absorb unexpected setbacks, qualities the German High Command had underestimated in their planning. The convergence of terrain, weather, and logistical strain ultimately undermined the initial successes of Operation Barbarossa, demonstrating that tactical brilliance could not compensate for environmental and operational realities. Encirclements and rapid captures, while impressive in their immediate impact, were transient victories contingent on the maintenance of supply lines and the ability to navigate terrain that increasingly favored the defenders. The German assumption that momentum alone would secure strategic objectives proved flawed, as natural obstacles, climatic conditions, and the sheer scale of the theater imposed constraints that reshaped operational possibilities. In the broader narrative of the campaign, these environmental and logistical challenges illustrate the limits of even the most ambitious military planning, revealing how geography and climate can dictate the success or failure of operations regardless of technological superiority or tactical skill. The Russian landscape, with its forests, rivers, and plains, along with the unpredictability of weather and the logistical demands of long supply lines, became silent yet decisive actors in the unfolding drama, shaping the course of battles, exhausting forces, and contributing to the ultimate operational failure of the German invasion. Through this lens, the story of Operation Barbarossa underscores the profound influence of environment on warfare, reminding us that no plan, no matter how meticulously conceived, can escape the constraints imposed by nature itself. As the smoke of the initial blitzkrieg faded and the German war machine ground deeper into the Soviet Union, the ultimate reasons for Operation Barbarossa's failure became increasingly apparent, revealing a confluence of ideological overconfidence, flawed strategic planning, logistical overreach, and a disturbing moral blindness that permeated every level of command. From the very outset, the campaign had been driven not only by tactical ambitions but by a broader ideological vision that sought to secure living space in the East, subjugate the Slavic peoples, and implement racial policies that dehumanized the enemy. This overconfidence, rooted in a combination of Nazi racial doctrine and the belief in the invincibility of German arms, created a dangerous disconnect between the assumptions of success and the realities on the ground, setting the stage for miscalculations that would prove catastrophic. German planners had underestimated the scale, resilience, and strategic depth of the Soviet Union, assuming that initial victories and encirclement operations would trigger rapid collapse. The early successes, though impressive in their tactical execution, masked deeper vulnerabilities. Supply lines stretched over thousands of kilometers, mechanized units strained beyond sustainable limits, and the human and material costs of sustaining an offensive over such distances began to erode. Operational momentum. Terrain and climate added further obstacles, as muddy plains, swollen rivers, dense forests, and the harsh onset of autumn combined to slow movement, complicate communication, and expose the limits of even the most carefully prepared plans. armored spearheads, while tactically brilliant, were increasingly isolated from infantry, artillery, and logistical support, revealing the precarious balance between speed and sustainability. The German military, despite its initial coordination, was plagued by fragmented planning among branches, with the army, navy, and air force often pursuing separate objectives and Hitler frequently intervening in operational details. These interventions, though sometimes intended to accelerate progress, instead created confusion and delays, leaving commanders uncertain and operational cohesion fractured. Meanwhile, logistical shortcomings, insufficient supplies, fuel, and maintenance support exacerbated the strain on the front lines, turning early momentum into an overextended, vulnerable offensive. Even as vast numbers of Soviet prisoners were captured, the human and material demands of handling them, combined with the deliberate mass executions sanctioned by policies like the Commissar Order and martial law, diverted attention and resources while exposing the German forces to moral and psychological consequences. These atrocities, committed with systematic intent, reflect another dimension of Barbarossa's failure. Moral blindness. The regime's ideological drive permitted, even encouraged, mass killings of civilians and prisoners of war. Actions that, while temporarily facilitating occupation, undermined any potential for sustainable control and fueled resentment, resistance, and partisan warfare. Rather than securing stable governance or cooperation, the deliberate brutality intensified opposition, drained manpower, and forced German units to expend effort policing areas rather than advancing strategically. This moral collapse, coupled with overconfidence and operational errors, compounded the difficulties imposed by logistics and environment, creating a multi-layered crisis that no tactical adjustment could fully resolve. In hindsight, Barbarossa serves as a stark illustration of how hubris, ideology, and poor strategic foresight can converge to doom even the most formidable military campaigns. German leaders overestimated the impact of early victories, underestimated the complexities of the operational theater, and failed to anticipate the resilience and resourcefulness of the Soviet state and its people. The campaign's ambition, driven as much by ideological vision as by military necessity, collided with practical realities, resulting in a slow attrition of forces, escalating losses, and ultimately a strategic stalemate that marked the beginning of Germany's undoing on the Eastern Front. Each miscalculation, from planning errors to logistical oversights to the deliberate perpetration of atrocities, contributed to a cumulative failure that could have been foreseen had realism-tempered ideology and moral responsibility been applied to the conduct of war. As we reflect on the lessons of Barbarossa, the story is not merely one of military history, but a broader warning about the dangers of overconfidence, the ethical costs of ideological extremism, and the limits of planning in the face of environmental, human, and strategic realities. It reminds us that no army, no matter how disciplined or technologically advanced, can overcome the combined forces of terrain, climate, logistics, and human resilience without careful preparation, humility, and ethical consideration. The failure of Operation Barbarossa, while rooted in the specifics of 1941, carries enduring relevance for any consideration of the intersection between ambition, power, and responsibility. Thank you so much for watching and joining us on this deep dive into one of history's most ambitious and ultimately flawed military campaigns. If you found this exploration insightful, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our future content. Your support helps us continue to uncover history's fascinating stories and analyze them in detail. Wishing you all a restful night. sweet dreams. And may history's lessons inspire you in ways that last well beyond the screen. Good night.